Welcome, everybody. My name is Nat Kendall-Taylor. I help lead an organization called the Frameworks Institute. I have spent the last 25 years of my life studying cultural mindsets and how culture shapes the way that people think about social issues in general. But I've spent most of my time, or a lot of that time, thinking specifically about the issue of early childhood, and really excited to be with you here today to talk about some recent research that we've been part of, and I think more importantly, or most importantly, have a really engaged and robust discussion with two fantastic panelists who you can see on the screen right now in front of you. So I'm joined, and I want to just thank you both, Leah and Lindsey, from the beginning for joining today. So I'm joined, and you are going to be really lucky to hear some comments after I'm done with my part of the spiel here from Leah Austin, who is president and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute. Thank you so much for joining with us today, Leah. And Lindsey Burghardt, who is the Chief Science Officer at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. And thank you very much as well, Lindsey. So I have a couple of housekeeping items at the very beginning. So we are not going to be doing a live chat today, but we do have some time at the end for Q&A. And the way that that makes sense is that we have invited people as part of registration to submit some to pre-submit some questions, and we have a ton of really interesting, really difficult, I'll leave the difficult ones for you, Leah and Lindsey, questions that people have very graciously and kindly pre-submitted. So we'll take some of those at the end. And then the only other piece of housekeeping is if as many of you can stay on till the very end of this hour, and follow the QR code that I'll put on the screen at the end of our time to fill out a brief survey that will help us get better at doing these going forward. I'd be incredibly grateful for that. I also want to acknowledge that there was supposed to be a third panelist with us here today. So Dolores Acevedo Garcia, who's a professor at Boston University and is director of the Institute for Equity in Child Opportunity and Healthy Development, was a part of this panel and really helped shape a lot of the content and what we're going to be delivering to you. She was unable to attend today, but I'm really hopeful, crossing my fingers, that we can engage Dolores kind of moving forward and bring her voice back into this conversation. So even though she's not here, I wanted to make sure I also thank Dolores for her role. So I'm going to jump right into a quick agenda of what we're going to do. I'm going to start off by presenting some of the findings from the research on a project that we call Place Matters. I'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open things up. I'll stop my screen share so that you can see Leah and Lindsey again. And I will lead us through a set of questions really about how they both, in their different positions, in their different organizations, doing slightly different work, kind of see this research and are thinking about how they might use it in their work. And then we'll open things up. Well, we won't open things up. We'll take some of the pre-submitted questions, and the three of us will really kind of discuss and engage with those questions. And then at the end, like I said, please stick to the end and complete the survey at the very end of our time together. And that's it. That's what we're going to do. This hour is going to go really fast, and so I'm going to get right into it. I have the unfortunate job first of laying out a couple of core concepts. I know that sounds like an absolutely riveting way to begin a webinar, but I'll try to do this both quickly and in an interesting and fast-paced and engaging way. But these concepts are going to be key to understanding the research that I'll then pivot and talk about, that then Leah and Lindsey and I will be discussing for the rest of our time. So the first concept is framing. I imagine almost everyone on this call has heard about framing at one time, but I imagine that there's at least as many definitions of framing as times you've heard it. So my job, my mission in life is to provide some common definition and shared understanding of what this means. And so when we talk about framing, at least for the next 55 minutes together, what we're talking about is the choices that we make all the time in how we present ideas. And those can be quite obvious choices, the values that we use to advocate, to argue for why our issues are so important and for why finding solutions matters so much, the metaphors that we choose and use to explain how complex phenomena work. Do we talk about early brain and biological development or building brain architecture? But it's also important, and you'll see this in the work, it's also framing in the smaller, kind of more subtle and seemingly insignificant choices that we make all the time. It's in the pronouns that we use and whether we talk consistently about they, them, those people over there, or we talk about we and our. It's in the power of something as small and seemingly insignificant as a verb to extend and grant agency and power to groups of people or systematically deny it. So framing is all those choices, big and small, and how they affect three things that I know Leah and Lindsey care a lot about, but I imagine that everybody on this call cares about and is trying to do in their work, which is how people think about our ideas, how people understand the information, the ideas, the solutions that we're presenting. Importantly, how people feel, like people's level and type of emotional engagement. Do people lean in and engage with what we have to say, or exit and tune out? And then, really importantly, what people do, the decisions, the behaviors, the actions that people are or are not willing to take as a result of hearing what it is we have to say. So here's a really quick example. This is an online experiment that was conducted in partnership with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child about 7 years ago now. So this is a large online experiment. It's conducted with about 6,000 people living in the United States who are selected in a way to be nationally representative of all the demographic and geographic categories you're probably thinking of. The way that this works is each of those 6,000 people gets randomly assigned to one of three different groups. So people randomly assigned to the first group are primed or invited to think about this value of collective progress and social prosperity that you see on the lower left-hand part of your screen. So they would read about 80 words that describes a child mental health program, but the first sentence that they get in that description sets this value, primes this way of thinking. So they'd read something like, it's important that we do a better job of supporting children's mental health in this country because we wouldn't say it in such a cliched way, like children are our future, right? Their solid and stable mental health, their healthy development are key to our ability to move forward together. People randomly assigned to the second condition get those exact same 80 words about the program, but that first sentence is different. So they would read something like, it's important that we do a better job of addressing children's mental health in this country because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy and compassion, and we must do better to support them as an at-risk and vulnerable group. People assigned randomly to the third group are the lucky group. They get no message. And then everybody answers the same set of questions that are designed to measure how supportive they are of a set of evidence-based policies. So when you run this experiment, you get these two really interesting bars, right? So the bars indicate how much exposure to those two subtly different ways of framing the message has on how people support these solutions. So you see collective progress and social prosperity is boosting people's support for these solutions, making them more willing, more likely to get behind, to demand these kinds of solutions. That's the good news. The less good news that you see and are probably sitting with right now is that this value of vulnerability is having the opposite effect. So it is making people, to a statistically significant degree, less willing, less likely to get behind and support these solutions. So we did an interesting piece of analysis after this that makes the story either more interesting or more depressing, depending on whether you work on child mental health or not, where we looked at all the field's external facing materials over a year-long period. And guess which value we found to be kind of the lead value frame in almost 90% of those communications. So this has to be a rhetorical question because we're all on mute. So it was the value of vulnerability. So the takeaway here is that what you all know about early childhood, about the issues that you work on, matters a great deal. I'm not going to stand or sit in front of you here today and say that that doesn't matter. But what I am going to argue is that there's something else that really matters, and that is the choices that you make in how you say what you have to say, how you communicate about the connections between place and racism and early childhood development can be the difference between whether those messages cut through and have their intended effect or get rejected and have this backfire effect. Okay, so now that everybody is all in on framing, Lindsey and Leah are all in on framing, amped, ready for more. I want to dig into this kind of deceptively simple looking orange arrow that connects these two concepts. So one of the mechanisms, one of the ways in which the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say influence these outcomes that we care about in terms of thinking, feeling, and acting are these things called cultural mindsets. And so cultural mindsets have four characteristics that are vital for us realizing their strategic importance in our work. So first of all, they are implicit patterns of reasoning, ways of thinking that have their effect on our thinking, feeling, and acting below the conscious level. Second, they are incredibly powerful in shaping how we see the world, how we think about issues, how we think about solutions, and really importantly for our conversation today, how we see and think about groups of people and differences between groups of people. Third is that on all issues, certainly issues as complex as parenting and early childhood and race and racism and communities and government, we all have multiple ways of thinking about issues. We all have multiple mindsets that we can use to make sense of information. Now, some of those ways of thinking, which we'll see, are productive, right? They open up space for people to think about new ideas and entertain the importance of new solutions. Other mindsets are unproductive, right? They lead people to shut down, to close off, to lock down their thinking, and sometimes to outright reject the kind of information that we're communicating. And last but not least, the link between these two core concepts is that the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say determine at any given moment and over time which of those available mindsets are activated and pulled to the forefront of our thinking, where they play this outsized role and have this big effect in shaping our thinking, feeling, and acting, and which of those mindsets are backgrounded, where they play less of a role and have less of effect on those outcomes that we care about. So just to make this mildly more concrete for a short second, individualism is a dominant mindset in this country. It shapes how people think about a myriad of social issues, including early childhood, including place, including racism. This is the idea that the world is the way that it is, that outcomes that people experience are the way that they are as an exclusive result of how hard people try, right? Of people's decision to or not to exert their willpower, grit, gumption, drive, discipline, whatever it may be. And this is a really good example of a mindset not being necessarily right or wrong. Like we know choice and discipline and these things matter. But the significance is if that's the dominant way that we're seeing the world and thinking about specifically place, racism, and early childhood, there's a whole bunch of things that I imagine people on this call work on: institutions, relationships, communities, policies, interventions, resources that drop out of view as our attention is trained on the value, on the importance of those almighty bootstraps. So in our work on framing and communicating the science of early childhood over the last 25 years, there have been a set of dominant mindsets that we've tried to kind of take on and address through framing strategies to kind of create a mindset shift. So the first one is kind of a mindset that doesn't acknowledge the importance of early. And we've done a lot of work with a lot of partners, many of whom are probably on this call right now, in advancing a frame around the idea of brain architecture, that brains are built, and have seen over time how that has kind of shifted mindsets away from later matters more to a recognition that early matters. And I have no idea why, but all these target mindsets have exclamation points after them. So we're supposed to read those with great conviction and enthusiasm. Early matters. Okay. So the second one, a kind of a classic way of thinking about stress and adversity, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And we have tried through a taxonomy of stress, through the idea of toxic stress, to really make it clear that adversity can derail development, and have shifted from this what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of mindset to one that acknowledges that significant unbuffered adversity can derail development and that it must be addressed. Again, exclamation point. And then moving from a mindset around which the kind of inner workings of development are occluded or black boxed, to one that advances the idea of serve and return interactions as a way to get people to the recognition that, I don't know why that just did that. I'm sorry. I think I clicked the wrong button. You got to see this. Hold on. Okay, here we go. That relationships are key, serve and return interaction, which has really filled that in and led people to a recognition that supportive relationships are really a driving factor, are a key ingredient in this process. So we've been left, though, with this one fundamental mindset that we call the family bubble. This is the recognition or the assumption that family and parents are all that matters, and that family and parents are kind of insulated from broader environments. We have tried a bunch of stuff over the last 25 years to crack this one, right? We've tried changing words from caregivers, from parents to caregivers and caregiving to expand that family bubble. We've used metaphors to expand it. We've actually advised and kind of used different ways of using imagery to expand it, and have found really that these existing ways of reframing the issue are insignificant. They're insufficient. They don't fully widen the lens. And we have found that even with these ways of framing, we don't have a way of kind of really holding the connections between place, racism, and early childhood that we feel is a vital part of communicating about this issue. So we went back to the framing lab. And this is work that's been taking place over the last year to a year and a half, in which that was really our fundamental task. How do you shift? How do you crack? How do you perforate that family bubble to create more of a sense that what surrounds us shapes us? To create an opening and a way for people to make the connection and see how racism influences place and through place influences early childhood development. This is work, just to make a point, this is why it took us that long. This was not a couple of focus groups. This is really multi-method empirical research that includes interviews and focus groups and what we call peer discourse sessions, and some of the experimental surveys that are like that child mental health one that I showed you. And so here is the emerging strategy. And I'm going to acknowledge right at the beginning that this is going to be totally unsatisfying. I'm going to make a lot of really careful research and great recommendations, artificially simple for the purpose of time, to give us a sense and a flavor of what this is. And we'll really encourage everyone on this call to dig into the resources that are available, that will be available to kind of learn more about this strategy. So the first is that we found a value that was incredibly powerful in kind of beginning or orienting these conversations. This is the value of fairness across places. So this is appealing to the value of fairness, but in relation to place. So rather than talking abstractly about fairness, actually showing it's the critical nature of assuring fairness between place, of making sure that no matter where a child develops, that there is access to opportunities and that we are attending to exposure to adversity. Now, what we saw in the research is that exposure to this value of fairness across places had a bunch of positive, salubrious effects on people's thinking. So it increased people's structural understanding of racism. It increased people's systemic thinking about child racial disparities. It increased people's sense of collective efficacy. So collective efficacy is the sense that we can actually do something about this. We can make improvements at the intersection of these issues. And the last one is where you want to see a bar going down. It kind of depressed or decreased people's racist ideology, kind of made people less racist and presumptuous and stereotyping and biased in their thinking. So that value is paired with a set of two different narrative structures. So these two different narrative structures have a similar structure, but basically have a different protagonist doing the action. So in narrative number one, which is about redressing history, it's really the community that is the lead actor in this scenario. This is something, given Leah's work, that I'm going to be really interested in hearing from Leah about when I'm done talking. So this is the idea that a community comes together to confront an effect of a past racist act, event, policy, that the community brings attention to the issue and sparks discussion, puts pressure, advocates for city officials to make changes, and the city officials make changes guided by the community in ways that redress or address the issue. The second story is really one that pushes for and makes policy members and decision makers clearly accountable in this process. So in this story, local policymakers are the ones identifying the policies harming early childhood development. There is a role for community as a source of expertise and leadership, but it's then the policymakers who make changes to support development and address inequities. Again, this is one where we see these really positive effects across the outcome. So increases in structural understanding of racism and all these things we've talked about. And this narrative here, this is the redressing history. This is the first one. has the largest effect in terms of decreasing or depressing this kind of scale or measure of racist ideology. It's really interesting and important. Now, in the context of this value and one of these two narratives, there's these set of two overarching recommendations, which are really the power and importance of getting concrete and using specific examples of places where these events, where problems are occurring, and where solutions are being pursued. And second, to practice what we call, and this is a really interesting and kind of a new novel framing approach than we've seen in other work, what we call part to whole framing. So this is about pointing out a specific inequity that exists in a place. In this case, you can see the specific inequity is around water safety, making a point about the designed nature, the fact that this inequity is due to decisions made about how systems work, but then widening the lens to make it clear that this is not just one isolated part of a system, but that there's other parts of a system, whether that's access to parks or grocery stores or housing, where we're seeing a similar effect in place, and kind of moving from that specific, very concrete, very tangible example and widening the lens to make a larger, more generalizable set of points about the connections between place and racism and early childhood development. So at the end, the four recommendations that come out of this work really clearly are, first of all, like I said, to make it concrete, that we found that kind of vague invocations of the connection between these issues just don't win the day. And that when you get concrete and talk about specific places where things are happening and get really kind of granular in your specificity, you're much more effective. Obviously, people need to be in our stories, but these stories are much more effective. And this is essential to the connections that we're trying to make, to widen that lens, to include the way that environments, to include the way that systems that surround people shape their outcomes and are shaped by the decisions that we make. And that's really the third point, to not strike a fatalistic, dire, on fire crisis tone, but to strike a measured tone of agency, of efficacy, particularly around the role and the importance of community voice and community expertise in addressing and moving these issues forward. And then really the power of making, continuing and putting on repeat these connections and helping people make the kind of connect the dots between the way that child development is affected by place and how place is affected or shaped by racism. And so that's my part. I want to end with a quick quote. This is, I always say, my new favorite quote, although it's not new at all. It's from 1979, from James Baldwin, who, I realize the word framing and cultural mindsets aren't in this quote, but I really think what Baldwin is talking about is what we're talking about. So Baldwin said, "The world changes according to the way that people see it. And if we can alter even by a millimeter the way that people look at reality, then we can change the world." So I'd like to, at this point, invite Leah and Lindsey into the conversation. I have a set of questions that I have been dying to ask you two as we've been doing this research. And so now people get to see publicly these questions that I've had for a long time. So Leah, I'd like to start with you. And I'd like to ask you or invite you to talk, first of all, to talk a little bit about the work that you lead at the National Black Child Development Institute, and then kind of connect that work to why you think communicating about the connection between these three concepts, about the connection between place and racism and early child development, is so important and kind of at the heart of what you're doing.
Absolutely. I am happy to jump in, and I have to say that anytime you end with a James Baldwin quote, you've done it. So magnificent. I actually have a really wonderful story about him holding me as a baby, but we will talk about that at another time.
That's my next question. Forget the next question. That's the next question.
Absolutely. We will cover that. But good afternoon, and thank you for having me. As Nat said, I am Dr. Leah Austin. I'm the president and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute, also known as NBCDI. For over 5 decades, NBCDI has been committed to advancing the quality of life for Black children and families by transforming systems, shaping policy, and strengthening communities. Our work is guided by 8 essential outcomes that define what thriving looks like. One of those is that Black children live and play in safe communities. We believe that Black children should live in a place where they can play, grow, and feel protected. At NBCDI, we believe deeply that what surrounds us shapes us, and that a child's zip code should never determine their destiny. We're also using an Afrofuturist lens to imagine the world that our children deserve, one where every neighborhood has clean air and water, affirming schools, and good food. Afrofuturism invites us to dream forward, to take lessons from the past, apply the science of today, and build futures rooted in joy, safety, and collective care. So that's a bit about NBCDI. I will now sort of connect that to the second question around why this connection between place, racism, and development matters now. And to answer that, I'll start off by saying that I believe that most people understand that child development, even before birth, is profoundly shaped by the environments where children live, learn, and play. But what many people may not understand is that those environments are designed intentionally, right? And so they're shaped by policy decisions that we can now see have lasted over generations. And these are decisions that have been influenced by structural racism. And so this research is really helping us to name that reality and communicate it clearly. It's a great reminder that racism is built into place, and that by redesigning those places, we can really ensure that there's healthy development and fairness for every child. So at NBCDI, we see this truth in action every day. For example, in cities where children are exposed to higher levels of air pollution, often in Black and low income communities, we see higher rates of asthma, missed school days, and stress for families. What this research really helps us to ground is that that's not genetics. Those are not people problems. That's actually geography. It's design. And so when we talk about fairness across places, what I hear us saying, what we at NBCDI believe, is that every child deserves clean air to breathe, safe parks to play in, nutritious food to eat, and stable housing to come home to, no matter their zip code. And we believe that this does not have to be a dream, that it's by design, and therefore we have the power to redesign as we wish.
Mic drop. That was like that you like did it. You did the strategy there, Leah. That was awesome. Thank you so much. Um, so the follow-up and like the first part of this question is I realize like a little self-serving, so we can expand it. But I'm interested in like what feels, and you kind of started to answer it, but what feels most helpful about this research? And then the way to make it less kind of self-serving is like what questions do you think, or what questions do you think we haven't quite answered that remain to be answered? So you can answer that however, whichever way you'd like, Leah.
Absolutely. I'll start with what's most helpful. And I would say that sort of overall, what we find most helpful is that this research really gives us shared language and a structure to talk about early childhood race in place, and in a way that is very concrete, actionable, and hopeful. Um, 2 points that I would just highlight that I am finding helpful for NBCDI and that we're really thinking about are: one, making the invisible visible. So, explaining how racism shapes place, right? And so, if most people don't automatically connect race and place, people do understand and see inequities, but they may not link those two together. We're finding that this brief, with its emphasis on communicating how we explicitly make those connections and help people understand how racism influences the design of environment, that's really helpful in our work, especially because so much of our work is based in communities, with and within communities. The second point that I would share is really helpful for us is, in fact, the fairness across places frame. right? So rather than discussing fairness in general or between groups, the brief really focuses on geographical fairness, right? And so what talking about what's available in one community versus another really helps our audience to see how policy choices and systemic racism distribute opportunity unevenly. For NBCDI, that framing is really powerful because it shifts the thinking from personal blame, right? So it's not about, oh, well, parents, Black parents just need to do better. It becomes about our collective responsibility and a real understanding of how we can redesign places that support all children. In fact, we have a paper called the Afrofuturism and Systems Change paper, and we go really deeply into the mindsets and the shifts that need to happen across our 8 outcomes. And so I believe the paper has been shared in the chat. So welcome folks to grab that and to read it. So those are the points that I think are really helpful for our organization. You know, what I would say in terms of the challenge or the curiosity is really just, you know, thinking together about the current context that we're in and a time where many people are struggling or are challenged or are curious about the information that is in front of them and what's sort of factual, what's not, really just that piece of understanding information. I think that's something for us to continue to talk about and how this research can help folks to sort of distill between fact and fiction.
That's great. And you've set us up for our Q&A, our next part of our Q&A, because that is something that with the two of you, I'd really like to dig into. So for my communications colleagues on the call right now, we need to change the title of the report to Making the Invisible Visible. We'll credit you, Leah, but we need to do that. And then just one other thing that I want to lift up in what you were saying, which is a finding of the report, is the difference between kind of saying or declaring the connection between two concepts and showing and explaining. And really, this research has, in the way that you just said really beautifully, Leah, really advocates or shows the power of moving from a strategy that's kind of like declaration
Mhm,
of inequities to explanation of
mhm.
inequities. And I think that's like a really powerful and important shift. Clearly, something that you and colleagues have been thinking a lot about. Okay, thank you very much, Leah. We'll come back to you in a second. Lindsey, I would like to kick things over to you now. Kind of the same thing. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your work at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and why this research, kind of why this research is important, what it helps you do. So let's start with that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Thanks for having me. And Leah, I feel like that was a masterclass maybe in framing. Like
It was good. Yeah, it was
it was
good.
really good. So thank you. It was terrific. I became involved in this early childhood space because I was so like fascinated and compelled by the science and what science was really telling us about foundations of healthy development. And it just kind of blew my mind when I started to learn more about what influenced development, beginning before birth and even preconceptually. So what I'm trying really hard to do in my role is to understand and try as much as I can to continue to have my finger on the pulse of, as much as it's possible, this body of scientific knowledge around early childhood development. And this is science that's like continuously, it's expanding over decades. It continues to expand and evolve. And it's based on the tireless work of a lot of researchers who have been in this space for a long time. And I think it's telling us a really compelling story about the really broad range of influences that shape development. And so, what I aim to do with many other incredible people at our center is then go in and synthesize that science, think about what's most important there to highlight, and what do we need to highlight in order to garner support for policies and funding and programs, all that help to support young children facing significant adversity. And I think maybe the most fun step in that process is then getting to communicate the synthesized messaging and the scientific knowledge to people whose work are really affecting the well-being of young kids. And to me, the framing research is sort of the secret sauce in science communication. You know that I'm a super fan, and I think it's because it really empowers us with a research informed tool then to help garner that support. It really effectively shifts the mindsets around what we're trying to message. And like Leah said, I think one of the most important and helpful parts of it for me has been the consistency in the messaging, that you have something that's, can be applied over and over and over again when we're working on an issue. And I think right now that feels more important than ever, because I think what we're seeing is that the science can be sound, but if we can't communicate it in a way that builds support for these policies and programs and ongoing funding for young children, then I think we're kind of missing a big opportunity.
Yeah, so you're both doing this thing where you're stealing our thunder later, but that's okay. Because one thing that I want to talk about as we get farther down the line is this question of like implementation or application. So how do we take this work and really make sure that it gets out and has the effect in the real world that we've seen indications that it can have kind of in the framing lab. And so I think that kind of like discipline and repetition and persistence is really vital to that part of the conversation, Lindsey. But we'll get back to that. Now I'm stealing our thunder. I would like you, and you're gonna love this question, Lindsey, because like this is what you do. But I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about what the science says about these connections between racism, place, and early childhood development. So Leah mentioned air, and I know you do a lot of thinking about this. So I'd just love you to kind of like fill us in a little bit more about the science behind those connections.
Yeah, I would love to. And maybe I'll even use a couple of extra minutes for this. So like if the buzzer needs to come out, let me know. But like you said, I get kind of excited when I talk about this. And I think if we want to understand, how racism affects development, then we have to start by zooming out and think about like what affects development broadly. How do you start to think about that? And in kids, it's really well before birth, and even preconceptually, their development, it's really shaped by, and Leah articulated this so well, it's the full range of all these experiences and exposures that they have that are really embedded in the places where kids are living. And we've talked for many years about their social environments, which are so important. It's also the built environment, the natural environment that surrounds them. And we should say when we're talking about built environments, we mean everything from the quality of housing that children live in, the state of the sidewalks that are in their neighborhood. When we're talking about the natural environment, it's everything from the quality and temperature of the air that they're breathing, what's the prevalence of green space in their neighborhood. And really importantly, both these built and natural environments, they're shaped by bigger systemic forces. We're talking today about structural racism, which is a huge one. Climate change is another one that's like near and dear to my heart and so important in thinking about how environments are shaped. And when we take all these influences together, and Leah referred to this term as well, this is what we mean when we talk about a kid's developmental environment. And before kids are born, their biological systems, the brain gets a lot of attention, but it's much bigger than the brain. It's beyond the brain to the immune system, the metabolic system, kids' respiratory systems. They're constantly reading the environment in the places where they live. And they develop actually in response to what they read. So Leah mentioned air pollution. I think that's a great example. So kids are exposed to air pollution very early in life. Their lungs and their immune system adapt by reading that in their developmental environment through inflammation. And inflammation is really good in the short term because it keeps debris out of your lungs. It keeps it from entering your deeper airways. But when this response happens in your environment over time, it raises a child's risk of asthma. And so, the air pollution is a negative developmental influence, but these experiences and exposures can be positive too, right? So they can happen on both sides. And having clean air to breathe fuels positive development. And so the places now, and I think what we're getting to today is where children live influence what the exposures are, what the experiences are, what their developing biological systems are reading, and therefore their development. And so this is what we mean when we're saying place matters. This is why, in part it matters. And in the US, kids' level of exposure to these hazards or negative developmental influences and their access to opportunity, it's not distributed equally or randomly. And these conditions in developmental environments are really shaped by and deeply rooted in these choices that were made in our public policies and our social history. So as Leah again so beautifully articulated, the effects of this structural racism is leading to minoritized children being exposed to more toxins like air pollution, more extreme heat, more industrial waste, and having less access to these positive exposures like green space and clean air. And so these exposures are then what are driving the higher rates of these adverse outcomes that children of color experience compared with their white peers. So these racial distinctions are inventions created by society, as Leah again said so beautifully. There's no validated genetic criteria here. So when we're studying differences in ethnic and racial disparities among these health statuses, with rates of asthma again being much higher in Black children than white, these are differences in the lived experiences and exposures from developmental environments, not from the underlying genetic differences. So it's why place matters.
Wow, this is like I've like actually got a little goosebumps there. This is like a masterclass in framing. You all are you all are we invited the right people to be in conversation on this webinar. So thank you, Lindsay. That was great. I feel a little smarter about science after that. So thank you very much. Leah, I want to come back to you. Hopefully this came out in my what I unproductively framed as a totally unsatisfying presentation of the findings. But one of the kind of key components of the findings is the importance, the power, the responsibility of integrating science with community expertise and experience. Kind of those narratives are both ones that require, that turn on the kind of community voice, community expertise and experience and lived experience. So I'd love to hear about kind of the importance of this in your movement building work, and specifically if you could talk, if you'd like to, about kind of the village network model that you all use and how the findings from this research connect with this focus that you all have on lived experience, community voice, and kind of the central nature of those concepts in the work that you do.
Absolutely. I love to talk about the Village Network. So
Do it.
I love to talk about the Village Network. So first, let me just say that this is quite, you know, quite literally, quite frankly, at the heart of our work is this ability to integrate science research with community expertise. And I will say, I'll add that we're really intentional about using language like community expertise. Um, Experience is a part of having expertise, but expertise is a really important word to use when we're talking about how we bring community into conversations, how we invite community to the table. We create spaces where community are actually setting the table. It's really important that we're intentional about thinking about how we are leveraging what they know and the expertise that they really bring. So just wanted to take a moment to say why it's important to reference their experience as expertise. So again, really at the heart of our model, at the heart of what we do, and really at the heart of our village network. So we have 25 village affiliates across the country that make up this network. We quite beautifully represent pretty much every region of the United States. Across the country, these affiliates are really bringing this research to life, right? So they are combining the science of brain development, as Lindsey just gave us such a beautiful masterclass in that, with the lived experiences and expertise of parents, teachers, and community leaders. And so whether they are fighting for clean water, access to healthy foods, we've done some recent work around what culturally affirming assessments in pre-K need to look like. Our affiliates are on the front lines of figuring out what systems of care that ensure Black children are born at a healthy weight, or creating nature-based play spaces. This research helps them to really take those advocacy efforts and use the data, use the science, talk about how these issues or these facts of life show up in place. It really helps them to make those connections so that when they are doing their work, they're really turning this research into reality. And what we think is so important is that it allows us to move from just kind of the momentum of something, right? So momentum is really about like, oh, a spark. Oh, that was interesting. What moves you from momentum to movement? And what we're finding is that leveraging community expertise and combining it in connection with the research and the data is what will allow you to go from the spark or from that momentum into sustained movement that will hopefully get us to long-standing systems change.
That was great. Thank you, Leah. And I'm always so jealous of people who have those awesome phrases from movement to momentum. Like, can you help me do this, please? I love that. That was great. Thank you so much, Leah.
Absolutely.
And hopefully some of the questions that were pre-submitted are really around this importance of community voice. So I'm hoping as we get to the end of the conversation, we might have like a chance for one more of those questions. Um, Lindsey, I'm gonna go back to you, and I'm gonna preface this with this is, I think, a hard question. And it's really around, you are a science communicator, you are a science translator, it's what you do. We just heard some of it happen in real life. And communicating about science in our current context, it was never easy. It's become more complicated. And so I guess the question that I have to you is if you could talk a little bit about how you think about some of those challenges, but I don't want you to just focus on the challenge. I'd also like to hear about why you think it's important that we remain committed to the practice, to the function, to the value add of science communication and translation.
Can I say two? Can I give two challenges? Is that
You can.
okay?
If there's only two, I'd be quite happy.
I mean, I think two come to mind. Like there's this present moment, but I think actually what the present moment is can force us to do actually is to think about our consistency across moments, right? Because this one is here now, and I think we're gonna probably face another one in the future. I mean, I think okay. So the first that I would say is challenge is that I think a lot of us who grew up in science and with a scientific background, our default mode is we love to dive into those details and get technical and get very jargony because it's very much our comfort zone. And I think the more graphics and the more words we can put on this slide, the more comfortable we feel. I think it's even better if the graph is so complicated and so like tiny that no one listening can see it to ask us questions about it, you know? Like that's a challenge in science communication because it's really complex, but we need to get it out in a way that's not. And I think the second challenge is that as a movement, and now maybe even more so in this current moment, I think science has lacked consistency in messaging. And so I think like even now, I see people who care like a lot, very passionately about the same issues, communicating about it in really different ways, calling in many different values, a lot of different reasons why people should care. And I think that what that kind of does is that our audience then doesn't really quite hear any of us in an effective way. But I also think that the opportunity there to get to the second part of what you were asking is that like when we understand some of this framing research in particular, it actually pushes us to be very clear and very concise in what we want to say. And it forces us as scientists and science communicators to really simplify that messaging in a way that's really, I think, powerful. So like, you know, when we partner with your team at Frameworks to study how we want to communicate an issue or, you know, we have to start with this task that you give us of like, okay, distill down, like, what are the four most important things that you want to communicate? Like, what is it that if you thought people knew this, if they understood this, they would actually want to act you know, they would take that action. And I think that push for ongoing clarity is a challenge and an opportunity when it comes to science. I think right now, the importance of communicating developmental science in particular has never been greater. And it's so important, I think, because it's not only informing like what we need to do to protect kids, but when we need to do it. So this, you know, importance of stepping in early and pointing towards the power of protection when we think about taking care of kids early, I think is really great. And that I don't know, maybe I'm a developmental science geek, but I think it's so exciting because it's a science that's actually pointing us towards the solution space.
That's great. And I saw Leah nodding her head on that last point. That feels pretty resonant. So I'm just taking notes. So you said no complicated graphs, Lindsey. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah,
I should
yeah.
probably rewind and make some
Well,
changes there.
maybe hold me to that, you know.
Okay. We'll hold each other to that. Okay. So I want to switch now. That was awesome. And I do really feel like I learned some great things from both of you, even in that short period of time. So thanks for being so willing to jump in and kick around some ideas. So I want to switch now to taking at least, I'm going to try to do three of them. We got some wonderful pre-submitted questions, wonderful and very difficult. We won't do the difficult ones. We'll just do the easy ones. No, I'm joking. But there were a bunch of questions. I said I wanted to talk about implementation before, and there were a lot of questions around like, what do we do with this? So having research that, has complicated graphs, Lindsay, that shows the effects that the value of fairness across places has, or these different narratives is great. But if that research just sits on paper or just sits in a presentation, it does absolutely no good, other than being interesting. So the kind of question I'd love us to talk about is like, what can we do? What are your ideas, Leah and Lindsay, about how to make sure that this research gets out there, and informs the way that people think about strategy or practice communications? And there's no order here. We can just there's only three of us, so we can all kind of jump in. I'll try to make sure we don't talk over each other, but that's all I'm going to do. Who wants to start on that one?
Oh, I think Leah should start.
Okay. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah.
No, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think for me, one, I love this question because yes, there's yeah, for all the reasons. I mean, I'll say this. So at NBCDI, we talk about ourselves as both a think and a do tank, which I think gets to like the heart of this question. Is like we do a lot of thinking and research and idea generation, and people want to know, well, how does it move us into action? And so for me, one of the components that's really helpful is the toolkit. And so we're really planning on using and thinking about how do we use the toolkit? Like, how do we use the toolkit with our village network? We bring our leaders together monthly, virtually, and then we actually have in-person convening during our conference. And so thinking about how do we support our leaders in understanding the research, and then practicing and being able to actually use the tools. I think the other piece of it, so that's one very practical, is like, yes, there's a toolkit available. So, definitely read the brief. But if you can't read the brief and you want to get right to the action, that's what a toolkit is really useful for. So that's something that we're definitely going to be using. And then I think the second piece is just remembering to, as much as you can, like, keep it local and think about how in your classroom or in your early learning center or like in your community setting, you might be able to work on some of these strategies with a small group of people and then sort of watch the ripple effects come about from there.
I love that. I'll just build on that last point, Leah, quickly, and then Lindsay, I'll give you a chance to add on. But I mean, I think so many times we think about the way to use this work has to be in some big formal campaign, right? That's communications, but we're all communicators all the time. I mean, people who work on, again, I don't know what the 1,000+ people who are on this call do, but you communicate about early childhood all the time. And so I think part of what you're saying, Leah, is to think about, I love that, like think locally, like think in your everyday action scenario and how you might be able to use these tools, not just in the formal kind of communications, papers, campaigns that you do, but in how you talk with other practitioners, with community members, with parents about these issues. That's a really powerful and important way of applying this work as well. Lindsay, anything you want to add to that one?
No, I agree. I mean, I would love, like, I can speak from the science viewpoint. I would love to see us as scientists take our communications as seriously as we take our science, because I think that the science fills up a lot of the space. But I think a push for those of us who go out and talk about kind of the biology and how this all happens, to kind of push ourselves to be deliberate, to create time and space, actually to go back and understand and review and take a look at this. You guys have done, and other groups have done, a lot of really great research, and there's a lot out there about how we can frame in research backed and informed ways. And so I would love to see conversations about framing coming into more of the spaces that I find myself in medical schools, residencies, public health curriculum, other spaces. And I think, as Leah said too, I'm trying to do this in my own work. If I'm collaborating on a project or writing a paper or having a conversation about a topic, and I know that there's framing research on it, I try to go back and take a look at it, to share it. And I think there's a lot of ripple effect. Like you said, if there's 1,000 people listening and we all take a look and share it, it doesn't have to be a big, massive undertaking. It can be kind of taking what works in our context and applying it and
Yep.
being consistent.
Yep. That was great. I feel like we could talk about implementation for a long time, but I do want to end. We've got like 2 minutes, and I realize this is going to be really hard because I think it's like the question that's on everyone's mind. So I'll tee it up, and maybe we can each take like 30 seconds of providing some of our thinking. I won't say I have any wisdom on this, but maybe the two of you do. I have thoughts, but it's never been easy to talk about. It's never been easy or straightforward to talk about the intersection of these issues of place, of racism in early childhood. And I don't think it's gotten, this is an understatement, it hasn't gotten any easier. And so I guess the invitation at the end is like, do either of you have any wisdom or thoughts about like what is it going to take to make sure that these connections remain front and center in our conversations in a context that is kind of forcing them off the radar and out of the public discussion. Um, so I guess the question is like, what are your thoughts about how we talk about racism in the context of early childhood in places and times where that's increasingly complicated to do?
I'm happy to go first since I put Leah on the spot last time. I think for me, this comes back to like the consistency and clarity and being explicit in your message and saying what you mean. I can't remember how you put it so well beforehand, but instead of blasting headlines, really getting explicit about how these things happen, tying in value of fairness across place, but also that zooming in and giving a really concrete example of what this looks like, how it happened, and then the most important part, how it can unhappen or be redesigned, right? And I think when we give those concrete examples, it becomes a lot more difficult to have people come up and say that
Yep.
it's not true, that's not the case.
Yep. That's great. Thank you, Lindsey. That was a lot of wisdom in like 35 seconds. I appreciate it. That was great. Leah.
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. That was great wisdom. I think two things. One is we have to remember that although it may not seem like it sometimes, we still have so much more in common than we do not, right? And so being committed to our commonalities and our shared values. The other thing I would say is that sometimes the people who we need to influence the most are at our dining tables. So you may feel like, well, there's not a lot I can do in my school for different reasons, but there's a lot you can do at home with the people who you might actually have more influence over. And so I would, think very deeply about how are we talking about racism at our dinner tables.
Yep. That was great. And that is a conversation that we could continue having for an extended period of time. But I love those last little kind of nuggets of wisdom at the end, and really want to thank everybody for logging on and joining us, but Leah and Lindsey in particular for a really great conversation. I want to say a couple of things at the end before we log off. In addition to that, like profuse thank you, which I really feel like I thought that was a great discussion and appreciate the participation and the ideas. We do have the QR code here. Would love it if people could follow this link and fill out a brief survey that will help us kind of do this, kind of continue to get better at doing this thing that we're doing. I also want to say that NBCDI, Leah's organization, has their annual conference in Atlanta later this month, October 24th to 26th. It's going to bring together a bunch of experts, advocates, thought leaders, change agents. And I think there's going to be a link in the chat that you can follow to find out more about that. We are hosting another webinar on October 30th, where we'll be presenting findings from other new research on framing the relationship between climate change and early childhood. I think we'll also pop a link to that event in the chat, and would love you all to be part of that event. And yeah, just to thank everybody for your participation, for your attendance, for your time. I know it's really valuable. And just to end with the hope that I hope we can talk with as many of you who are on as possible and figure out how to partner and implement, as we talked about, this work going forward together. Thank you all very much.